Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Understanding Multi-Winner Ranked Choice Voting. The webinar will begin shortly. My name is Karen Brinson-Bell, and I am a member of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center consulting team. I will be your moderator for today's session. First, a few housekeeping matters. Participants have been muted for this webinar to reduce audio interference since we have a large number of attendees. If you have technical issues, please use the question option to send a message to the organizer so we may try to assist. Handouts are available in the Handouts tab of the control panel. To expand or minimize the control panel, click the orange arrow of your webinar taskbar. The handouts provided with today's webinar include a summary document on Multi-Winner RCV from the consulting team and several research studies conducted by FairVote. These are for additional reading and may not be referenced necessarily in today's webinar. If you have a question or comment regarding the session, please type that message in the question box. To keep this webinar to about 45 minutes and out of respect for your time, there will only be a brief question and answer session at the end. Questions we are unable to address during this live session will be answered in a follow-up document, which we will email to attendees and also post with a recording of this session on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center website in about a week. The Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center provides a compilation of best practices and first-hand experiences from jurisdictions that have used this method of voting. The website, www.rankedchoicevoting.org, and the overall project serve as resources for voters, election administrators, policymakers, candidates, and others. The consulting team of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center is not advocacy focused. Rather, the team aims to provide resources that allow jurisdictions to implement ranked choice voting effectively and efficiently. With extensive elections experience, and working together overseeing statewide, municipal, and district RCV elections, our team has focused on expanding the resources and information available regarding the administration of and education about this voting method. We are available to discuss whether or not RCV is an option for your jurisdiction and to assist in developing implementation plans, processes for tabulating results, voter education, and more. Our services are free, including travel. For this webinar, we have the following presenters to provide a better understanding of multi-winner ranked choice voting. George Gilbert served as the Director of Elections for Guilford County, North Carolina for 25 years. Guilford is North Carolina's third largest county. In 2010, North Carolina conducted the first statewide use of RCV in the United States since the 1930s. George was part of the steering committee that developed the materials and tabulation procedures for all 100 counties. Chris Hughes is the staff attorney for FairVote and serves as a liaison between FairVote and the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. His work focuses on the intersection of law and election administration and ensuring that administrators and activists can best understand and collaborate on ranked choice voting. We'll now welcome George and to begin today's presentation on multi-winner ranked choice voting.
Thank you, Karen, and good afternoon, everyone. I plan to go a little deeper into the weeds today than we have in our previous seminars, and I hope you will find that they are not weeds after all, rather a complex but orderly structure that's well suited for its purpose. In general, there are two types of ranked choice voting, single winner and multi-winner. In our preceding webinars, we focused primarily on the single winner ranked choice voting, which is often referred to as instant runoff voting. Today, we'll spend most of our time on multi-winner ranked choice voting, which is also known as single transferable vote. In traditional multi-member elections, each voter may vote for as many candidates as there are seats to be filled, but such winner-take-all elections often violate fair representation principles and the legal requirements of the Federal Voting Rights Act. A majority of like-minded voters can elect all the members to an elected body within a district. This often leaves any voting minority entirely unrepresented. And as we know, this has been the subject of numerous voting rights lawsuits. To start, Multi-Winner RCV is presented in the same ballot format as single winner, with voters simply ranking their choices in the order of preference, as shown here on this example. However, with more than one candidate being elected, there are differences both in the counting process and in the representative character of the outcome. In the multi-winner RCV process, candidates run at large or in districts with multi-seat. Such candidate offices as president or governor or mayor are clearly single-seat winner contests. Examples of potential multi-winner contests are a county commission, city council, school board, or a legislator, when more than one individual is elected at large, or for districts elections with multiple representatives within a district. The voting process here is identical to single winner RCV, with each voter having one vote expressed as rankings. However, with more candidates being elected in the contest, there are likely to be more candidates than in a single winner contest. This also may affect the jurisdiction's decision about how many rankings to allow. With multi-winner RCV, a quota or threshold determines when a candidate has been elected. And here is where multi-winner RCV begins to depart from the single winner process. We'll go into this in greater detail later, but essentially the threshold is the number of votes in candidates, that is the number to be elected, can receive, but N plus one cannot. For example, in a 3-seat contest, the threshold is the number of votes 3 candidates can receive, but 4 cannot. Each voter's single vote is eventually counted toward one candidate, or in modern STV methods, divided among multiple candidates. Whether counted for one candidate or divided among multiple candidates, the value of each vote remains 1, thus the term single transferable vote. And finally, multi-winner RCV results in proportional representation. As the phrase implies, proportional representation is representation that reflects the mix of views and interests of which a jurisdiction is made up. Ranked choice voting assures that any substantial like-minded group can win representation roughly in proportion to its share of the vote in the represented region. This stands in contrast to the winner-take-all systems, in which, as mentioned, a majority or even a plurality of voters controls the makeup of the whole body to the exclusion of minorities. In proportional representation systems, a majority of voters will still elect a majority of a legislative body, but smaller groups have the power to elect representatives as well. The idea behind proportional representation was well stated by 19th century theologian and philosopher Ernst Navel when he said, "In a democratic government, the right of decision belongs to the majority, but the right of representation belongs to all." Some of the benefits of proportional representation include wider representation. We will demonstrate this shortly, but in general, among voters, there are fewer losers. Most voters end up supporting a winning candidate. Candidate quality and diversity is also often encouraged. When there's single-seat districts that are uncompetitive, the minority party finds it difficult to recruit high-quality candidates who are capable of running a competitive race. This is because the outcome of the election is often a foregone conclusion. Proportional representation can also enhance diversity of representation within parties. Voters within our major parties have a fairly wide range of views on many issues. A PR system has the ability to represent that range of views within a party or another voting group, as well as positions across groups of parties. And while proportional representation is often credited with making representation available to third parties, what's often overlooked is the fact that it also enables representation of major parties when they are a local minority. For example, let's take a California General Assembly election. With ranked choice voting, multi-seat, you could elect a few Republicans even in San Francisco, where currently all the members are Democrats. This would, of course, balance out with the election of a few Democrats in the Republican-dominated Central Valley. Now, historically, many voting rights complaints center around the problems of plurality at large elections. The most common fix proposed in most of these situations has been the imposition of district elections. This solution has suffered from at least three major defects. The first is that it relies on gerrymandering, or the artful drawing of district boundaries. Second is this approach requires sufficient segregation that such districts can, in fact, be created. And finally, as with all single-member districts, many, and perhaps even most voters end up without representation of their views. Further complicating the picture, recently, a federal three-judge panel for North Carolina's Middle District struck down North Carolina's 2016 congressional plan as an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander. This ruling places the primary basis for drawing districts on an uncertain legal footing. A similar case from Wisconsin is currently before the U.S. Supreme Court. So with both the traditional at-large elections and the traditional basis for drawing single-member districts suspect under the law, proportional representation may provide a constitutional and a fair solution. The multi-winner RCV solution uses larger multi-seat districts, but fills the seats proportionally. Minorities, as well as majorities, are empowered to elect representatives in proportion to their numbers. And nearly all voters are able to contribute to the election of a representative of which they approve. Now let's look at how this actually works. As with single winner RCV, each voter ranks some or all candidates. Then the number of ballots cast provides the basis for the next step. And that is the calculation of a threshold or quota, with the threshold being a number greater than the number of valid ballots cast divided by the number of seats to be filled plus 1. This might be best understood as a percentage, and it results in a threshold of 25% plus for 3-seat contests, a threshold of 20% plus for 4-seat contests, or a threshold of 10% plus for a 9-seat contest. This is the percentage of the vote that a candidate needs in order to get elected. Now, being elected with 10% of the vote may not sound like majority rule, but think about it. If there were one majority winner from each of 9 single districts, each representative would have been elected by a very small percentage of the total vote. Say each district had 1,000 voters, each winner gets 51%, they would each have less than 6% of the citywide vote. In a similar RCV multi-seat election, each winner would be required to receive 901 votes to reach the 10% plus threshold. In fact, in filling any number of seats, multi-winner RCV requires greater support for winners than a comparable single-member district method. The next step is if a candidate's votes exceeds the threshold, the extra votes are transferred to the voter's next highest ranked candidate. This ensures that all votes are fully meaningful to the outcome, and that a majority view will elect a majority of the seats. And subsequently, if there are still seats to be filled, just as in single winner RCV, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and his or her votes are then counted for their next highest ranked candidate. At this point, I think we need some visual support for this explanation. Apparently, in the wider animal kingdom, each member of a species makes the same second choice. But of course, as we know, humans tend not to all have identical second choices, even if they have the same first choice. Typically, these second and third choices will be spread across several other candidates. There are generally two methods for redistributing these surplus votes to their next choices. First is the weighted inclusive Gregory method, a version of which is used in Minneapolis. And the other is the Android or Cincinnati method, a version of which is used in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Let's look at the weighted inclusive Gregory method first. Let's say there are 3 seats to be filled and 100 votes are cast, and the threshold would then be 25 plus. Normally, we would think plus 1. However, the weighted inclusive Gregory method allows for fractional votes. Here, the threshold is the number of valid ballots, that is B, divided by the number of seats to be filled, S, plus 1, and X is some small extra amount between 0 and 1. In this case, the threshold could be a fraction of a vote more than 25% in our example. So how do we obtain a fraction of a vote? First thing we do is calculate what is called a surplus fraction. This is the candidate's extra votes, that is those above the threshold, divided by the candidate's total vote. With a threshold of 25 votes and a candidate who received 31 votes, the surplus fraction would be 6 divided by 31, which is equal to 0.1935. This is our surplus fraction. Next, each of the 31 votes next highest ranked choice would receive 0.1935 of a vote as the transfer value of the surplus. This results in transferring 5.9985 votes to other candidates, leaving the winning candidate with 25.001 votes, which is greater than 25 or equal to the threshold. Using the weighted inclusive Gregory method, no voters' votes are simply left where they are not needed. You do not end up transferring only the last ballots counted, and each voter's ballot shares equally in the transferred surplus. Again, let's look at a visual demonstration of how this works. This one is compliments of Minnesota Public Radio.
Vote for your favorite colors.
The instant runoff way.
Now with fractions. We already showed you how instant runoff elections work when there's only one winner.
But when there's more than one winner, it's a little more complicated.
We have 5 colors to choose from, and we're going to end up with 3 winners.
To start, each voter chooses a favorite color, a second choice, and a third.
All right, purple is my first choice, yellow comes in second, and I'll put blue in third place.
Now we need a scoreboard. There were 36 votes cast. There will be 3 winners.
In order for a color to win, it needs more than a quarter of the vote. That's because if a color gets that much, then it's mathematically impossible for it to lose.
36 divided by 4 is 9, and we need just over that.
So plus 1 is 10.
10 votes is the finish line.
Make it there, and you're one of the 3 winners.
So let's count the votes.
No one's reached the finish line yet. That means it's time for round 2.
And orange got the fewest votes, so it's out.
Everyone who voted for orange first now gets their second choice.
Purple reached the finish line.
In fact, purple has more votes than it needs.
That means each purple voter can take back a fraction of their vote and still leave purple with enough to win.
Under instant runoff rules, that's exactly what they get to do.
Purple has 2 votes to spare.
And that gets divided among the 12 purple voters.
So each of them gets 1/6 of their vote back.
And that little piece will go to their next choice.
Now blue has reached the finish line.
No votes to spare.
So no more fractions. Green is in last place. You know the drill.
Most of these votes are for colors that have already won or are already out.
We call those ballots exhausted.
Yellow didn't quite make it to the finish line, but there's no one else left.
So we have our 3 winners.
The instant runoff way.
Well, obviously, this method is largely geared, or excuse me, I need to insert a disclaimer here first. We do not recommend implementing this by tearing off pieces of ballots and placing them in different piles. Minneapolis actually executes the math in a spreadsheet. And the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, as well as most vendors, are developing tabulation programs designed to do this for you. Turning now to the Andre or Cincinnati method. This is the version that has been used in Cambridge, Massachusetts since 1941. While largely geared toward hand-counted multi-winner elections, and it counts only whole votes in the surplus. While Cambridge began with hand-counting ballots, in the mid-1990s, they implemented computer tabulation also. And this enables them to publish their unofficial results on election night. Essentially, this method semi-randomly selects the surplus ballots, the extra votes above the threshold, from all the ballots cast for an elected candidate with a surplus. For instance, if a winning candidate has a 10% surplus, then every 10th ballot cast for them is selected, and the next highest ranked continuing candidate is given that vote. This at least minimizes any bias that may be introduced by the order in which the ballots are counted. Again, if the last ballots counted for a winning candidate were selected as the surplus votes, they might all come from a precinct where the voter's next choice candidate was different than in another precinct. This could change the outcome. The Andre or Cincinnati method, in effect, shuffles the deck. And while there are other variants of these 2 multi-winner RCV tabulation methods, these are the ones currently used in U.S. elections, and they demonstrate the fundamental principles. As mentioned, Cambridge has used multi-winner RCV since 1941. RCV's history actually goes back even further. At this point, I'm used to provide a little of this history.
Thanks, George. So multi-winner ranked choice voting was invented in Europe in the 1850s by Thomas Hare, a British barrister, and Carl Andre, a Danish mathematician, who lends his name to that surplus transfer method that George just covered. Multi-winner ranked choice voting was first used in the United States in Ashtabula, Ohio city council elections in 1915. Multi-winner ranked choice voting was eventually adopted for use in 24 US cities for their city councils and or their school boards in the period 1915 to 1962, with adoptions during the Progressive Era, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, World War II, and the post-war era. One of those adopting cities was Worcester, Massachusetts, whose 1955 city council ballot is pictured on this slide. Multi-winner ranked choice voting was adopted in these cities due to demands for minority party representation on councils and school boards, and a desire to decrease the power and influence of party bosses in cities. Once ranked choice voting was adopted, these 2 gaps were met. But because ranked choice voting made it difficult for party bosses to control members of their party in these representative bodies, members were sometimes split between coalitions they joined in the councils and their identified party. This meant that sometimes representatives would vote with their coalitions and against their party's interest, and sometimes vote with their parties and against their coalition's interest. This meant both party cohesion and coalition cohesion could suffer, leading to disillusionment among proponents of the system. This meant the second most popular party in a city would join with the largest party in a city to repeal ranked choice voting, thereby kicking out minority parties from the council and restoring party boss power. Other factors, such as the adoption of lever-based voting equipment and increased representation for ethnic and racial minorities, also contributed to repeal in these cities. By 1962, 23 of those 24 cities had repealed multi-winner ranked choice voting. But as George mentioned, Cambridge has continued for more than 70 years to use RCV for its city council and school board elections. It actually just held multi-winner ranked choice voting elections this past November. For more on this history, check out our History of RCV webinar with Jack Santucci, or check out Jack's work at www.jacksantucci, spelled SANTUCCI.com. Interest in ranked choice voting began a resurgence in the United States in the late 1990s and early 2000s, starting in San Francisco. Most adoptions have been of the single winner form, but multi-winner ranked choice voting was adopted in Minneapolis for 2 local boards in 2006, with elections starting there in 2009. A number of cities, counties, and states throughout the US are considering the adoption of multi-winner RCV this year. Ranked choice voting is also used for student and faculty elections in colleges and universities in 22 states. Multi-winner ranked choice voting has been used in Australia, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, New Zealand, and Malta for local, state level, and national elections for decades. And finally, India, Pakistan, and Nepal use the system for internal governmental elections. Nepal actually just adopted it in December 2017, so they haven't used it just yet. The future of multi-winner ranked choice voting is unknown, but it is now a vital part of the election reform discussion. I'll cover a few highlights in this slide. First, in 2017, the California General Assembly passed Senate Bill 1288. This bill authorized any local jurisdiction in California to use single or multi-winner RCV in their local elections. I do want to note that charter cities in California can already adopt any form of ranked choice voting, regardless of the status of this particular bill. While the governor did veto SB 1288, it was the first piece of state legislation passed in decades that authorized and spelled out in detail a comprehensive set of RCV rules and procedures. Next, we have the Fair Representation Act, or HR 3057, which was introduced in Congress in 2017 by Representative Don Beyer of Virginia, and would require each state with more than one representative to establish multi-member districts with elections conducted using multi-winner RCV. Then, this year, Arizona, Massachusetts, Virginia, Washington State, Santa Clara, California, and Montgomery County, Maryland are all considering the adoption of multi-winner ranked choice voting for local or state elections. Santa Clara will be holding a vote on their adoption of multi-winner ranked choice voting this June. If it passes, Santa Clara will be the first city to adopt multi-winner RCV for its city council since the 1950s. The next version of the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, also known as the VVSG, is expected to include comprehensive standards for ranked choice voting. This will place RCV on par with plurality voting in terms of independent assurance of security and integrity of certified vendors' products. Finally, work is ongoing in California to introduce multi-winner ranked choice voting as a remedy to claims filed under the state's California Voting Rights Act, something specific to California, to better represent well-integrated racial and ethnic minority communities throughout the state. And as mentioned earlier, the constitutionality of partisan gerrymandering is currently before the Supreme Court. Whether the Supreme Court supports or reverses lower court rulings in the Wisconsin and North Carolina cases, the adverse effects of gerrymandered single-member districts remain, no matter how the districts are drawn. I hope this webinar has at least demonstrated that there is a viable alternative to those single-member districts. I'll now pass it back to Karen for next steps in our Q&A.
Thanks, Chris and George, for a great presentation. Today's webinar has been recorded, and we will hold a brief question and answer session in a few moments. The recording and supplemental Q&A document will be the 8th addition to our webinar series archives, which are posted on our website. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We have also launched a podcast called RCV Clips, which is available through iTunes, Google Play, and SoundCloud. Last but not least, we invite you to attend From Idea to Implementation, a ranked choice voting and voting systems symposium, which we are hosting April 23rd and 24th at the Friday Conference Center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This first of its kind national public event will focus on best practices and case studies for RCV presented by some of the country's leading election experts, and voting system demonstrations and presentations from the nation's voting system vendors. To learn more and register, go to www.rankedchoicevoting.org/symposium. Thanks for joining us today, and now let's move into the Q&A segment, and I'll get Chris and George back on the line with me.
We should be here now, right?
You are here now.
Great.
And I think y'all may have stumped them today. We actually don't have as many questions today as we have in the past. One question though is can multi-winner ranked choice voting be implemented in the way that we know single winner has been?
Well, this is George. I can respond to that. And basically, yes. As we noted in an earlier slide, the ballot layout for a multi-winner seat is almost identical, or is identical to the ballot layout of a single winner seat. The only difference is the instruction that tells the voter how many people are going to be elected. But the voting process, as executed by the voter, is the same. And then the ranked choice voting tabulation process would, of course, be done using a computer tabulation system in most cases. The only significant change was that if you had a small jurisdiction doing this and they were using hand counting, that would be different. That would be a little more complicated, take a little bit longer than single winner.
Yeah. Well, and I can add that I think one of the more challenging aspects of multi-winner ranked choice voting is explaining the results to people. And we've done some great work with the Center for Civic Design on presenting multi-winner ranked choice voting results in a really accessible and straightforward way. So you can see that on our website at the usability toolbox. You can see some of those examples, and we're continuing to work on that with them now. So as we progress with that, you'll hear more. I know we have another usability webinar penciled in for sometime this year once we've sort of closed the loop on all of that work.
Well, Chris, you touched on another, on the fact that we'll have some upcoming webinars, and I know one of those that we're planning is to talk about post-election audits. We've gotten a question in from Colorado, which now requires risk-limiting post-election audits. How do you conduct an RLA or a ranked choice contest? And I know both of you have been working on this subject. So, George, I guess I'll start with you, and Chris, you can chime in if you have something else.
Sure.
I will be happy to yield to my colleague, Chris.
So it is a really good question, and we don't have a great answer right now, I will say. So right now you can conduct a risk limiting audit using the methods that Philip Stark and Mark Lindemann pioneered for a single winner ranked choice voting contest. But there isn't currently a well-defined method for auditing a multi-winner ranked choice voting contest as an STV. We are working, or not we, but Ron Revest, a professor at MIT who's done a lot of work in the auditing election space as well, is working on applying something called Bayesian audits to multi-winner ranked choice voting to make them more accessible for risk limiting audits, because it is really important that we can trust and verify the results of our elections, especially when there's computers involved. And so we're working with him to move that research forward as quickly as possible. But it is, I think, one important opportunity is the potential of having multi-winner ranked choice voting elections conducted in somewhere like Colorado that requires RLAs, and being forced to really move the ball forward there to get all those questions answered as quickly and as publicly as possible.
And I'm not going to let you say any more because I don't want to spoil all the fun of our audit webinar. So that leads into a good intro for that webinar. here's another question, and George, I think you touched on this a little bit, and Chris, I know this is a discussion you've had. One of our viewers or listeners was listening very attentively and noticed that you mentioned there are other ways multi-winner can be implemented other than STV. What are those other ways?
Well, I think what I was referring to was other methods of tabulating ranked choice voting results. We discussed the weighted inclusive Gregory method. There's also the WIGM method, and the differences are mathematical, and there are a number of other slight variations on those themes. There's in terms of other methods of implementing multi-winner proportional representation, there is the list method, and that is when the parties submit lists of candidates, and then you rank your candidates, and then let's say party A gets 58% of the vote or 60% of the vote, and party B gets 40% of the vote. Then you would give 60% of the seats to party A and 40% of the seats to party B. So that's an alternative way of conducting proportional representation elections. I don't know if that fully answers that question, but Chris, do you have any thoughts on that?
I can add a bit. So single transferable vote is the only proportional form of ranked choice voting that can be used in a multi-winner election. There's other forms of multi-winner, or there's other kinds of ranked choice voting elections that elect multiple winners, though Fair Vote doesn't call these multi-winner RCV. To us, multi-winner ranked choice voting is the single transferable vote. But there are other methods of using ranked choice voting to elect multiple members to a legislative body that are either semi-proportional or winner take all. So, and not to get too deep into it, but winner take all meaning, the way we do elections now and the sort of traditional districts that George was talking about, the traditional at-large elections that we've moved away from because of their potential for unrepresentative outcomes.
I'll note for our listeners, one of the reasons we do the post-webinar Q&A document is so that our presenters aren't just answering on the fly and they can have a chance to add more details to their answers. So be on the lookout for that, and that may give you more information of what you were inquiring about. I think we have time for just one more question, and we did get a few more, so y'all will have more to write in your answers, Chris and George. But here's one regarding the number of rankings. Is there a recommended number of rankings suggested in relation to the number of seats? And this person out of California notes that their understanding is that the maximum, or that machines can only rank up to 10 candidates in their jurisdiction. So do you have any thoughts on the number of rankings to the number of seats?
Well, I have given that some thought, although we don't have an official recommendation on that. The research that we have done with the Center for Civic Design has certainly determined that a limited number of rankings is certainly more manageable by voters. Somewhere between 3 and 6 rankings appears to be good and manageable by most users in a single member ranked choice voting election. And when you get into a multi-member, that's a little different story. For instance, Cambridge right now has unlimited rankings for their 9-member council. They elect 9 members, and if they've got 38 candidates, you can rank as many or as few as you want, all the way up to 38. That's probably not something that most jurisdictions would want to take on. I would speculate, and Chris, you may have some thoughts on this as well, that you would want to rank at least as many candidates as there were seats to be filled.
I can speak a bit to, I don't have a really deep knowledge of this, but what I've seen from evidence in elections in Ireland and Northern Ireland, other places that have used STV for a long time, is that psychologically candidates do want to be able to rank as many candidates as there are seats. But that sometimes that isn't necessarily tied to the number of effective rankings they had, how many different candidates their vote can count towards if people they like get a surplus and there's a transfer. So we've seen that, people may need as few as 3 rankings, but it makes voters feel more comfortable and like they're casting a more effective vote if they can rank as many as there are seats to be elected.
Yeah. And I would say that even if in let's say if you had a 5 or 6 seat race and you were only ranking 3, your ballot would still count as effectively as it would if you ranked, say, 5 or 6. The difference is that there would likely be more exhausted ballots at the end of the tabulation process than otherwise. If you rank more, you end up generally with fewer exhausted ballots.
Right. The last thing I would add there is we have seen a lot of candidates run in like newly ranked choice voting election jurisdictions. So it's a matter of balancing the number of candidates who have voter comfort with the ballot and their ability to rank more candidates, and the effective power of those later rankings. So there's no hard and fast answer, but those are the 3 major considerations that go into designing your ranked choice voting ballot.
That sounds like a good place to stop. We have actually gone past our 45-minute window. We greatly appreciate the work of our presenters, and we greatly appreciate you joining us today. To our listeners, stay tuned for announcements about future webinars, including presentations on audits, the next phase of the usability testing, and much more. Have a great afternoon, everyone.